All right, folks, thank y'all for tuning in to today's chronic wasting disease virtual presentation, virtual meeting. This is a little different than what we're used to. You know, we would do CWD updates live and in person at a public meeting, but now because of COVID, we're doing this virtually. So we appreciate everybody that's tuning in today. And this presentation will be archived here on our Facebook page, and you can watch it if you don't get the chance to tune in. It'll also be on our YouTube page later on. So I want to introduce the folks that's on the panel today, and then we'll get started. Starting out with Chuck Yost. He's our Species Program Manager here in Nashville. Dr. Dan Grove. He's Assistant Professor of Wildlife Health, Wildlife Veterinarian for the UT Extension, Department of Forestry and Wildlife and Fisheries. He's our expert veterinarian here for the TWRA. Jeremy Dennison, he's our CWD Field Coordinator. He works out in West Tennessee. Ty Inman, District Sergeant out of West Tennessee. And then Stephanie Carnes as a wildlife biologist here in the Nashville office. So this is the panelist that's going to be with us today answering questions. And Chuck is going to kick us off with a short presentation, and then we'll jump into questions that we've received beforehand and online today. So come on up, Chuck.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We're sorry that we aren't able to do these meetings in person. We were committed to coming to each county that's affected by CWD and to have these conversations and visit with you all, but unfortunately we're unable to do that now. But we're excited about this opportunity, and we hope that it's a good replacement for what we all hoped that we were able to do. And Jason, real quick, thank you so much for calling Dr. Grove an expert. I know how much that means to him, and that was wonderful. So thanks for that. And so what I'd like to do over the next just a few minutes here is to give you an update on chronic wasting disease in Tennessee, and talk to you about some of the changes in management and hunting and all those things you guys are interested in. So here we go. So at the end of last deer season, unfortunately, we did see a drop in the harvest. But fortunately, we learned a whole lot about CWD in Tennessee. One of our goals for deer season was, with the help of hunters and landowners and the other deer management stakeholders, was to learn exactly where CWD exists in Tennessee and then how much is there. In other words, their prevalence. And what you see there, a visual, is all of the positive deer that have been documented. That came from the samples that hunters provided TWRA. So now we know better where it is and how much is out there. So that's basically what we have. You have an area there about 4,500 square miles, unfortunately. And then you also notice the area down there in Mississippi where there's quite a bit of chronic wasting disease that exists there, and we're working with them closely to ensure that we best manage this with our stakeholders. So we learned a lot. Unfortunately, the harvest dropped, but hopefully we can change that for the future. So what we have now for Unit CWD, or the affected areas, we have added 3 high-risk counties. So we've added Lauderdale, Crockett, and Gibson. So we now have 7 positive counties and 4 high-risk counties. And just as a reminder, those high-risk counties, we have not documented CWD in those counties. However, it is within 10 miles. So we manage as if it is there, just to do the best job that we can. So some more details that we learned from those sampling efforts is prevalence. We know that we have 2 high prevalence counties, those being Hardeman and Fayette County. And you see an image here that shows that we refer to those as the core area of CWD. And in other words, that's the high prevalence counties. And then we have the additional positive counties, the number being 5, where we have a low prevalence of CWD. Fortunately, it's low there, but it does exist there. So we have a great understanding now of where it is and how much is there, which is very helpful for management. So we not only added those high-risk counties to these tailored set of hunting regulations that we have to try to increase the harvest and target high-risk deer. And so for this deer season, we have that addition of those counties, and then we have we have added more gun hunting and more muzzleloader hunting in those counties. So come deer season, or for the remainder of deer season, the only time at which you can legally deer hunt in those counties in which you could not use a gun or a muzzleloader would be the archery-only season. So that's a pretty significant change to try to increase the harvest there and to better manage CWD. We've discontinued the mandatory physical check stations that we had there in the past. Thankfully, we're getting enough samples that we don't have to add that burden to hunters or to other stakeholders in order to get all the information that we need to be as informed and make the best decisions as we can. And then we also removed the limit on earn-a-bucks. You'll remember that that's a new program available there. Previously, it was limited to 2, but that's no longer the case. So that's a pretty significant change. Next. And I also wanted to mention that there's a new management option for the landowners in the area. We've changed our control permit system in TWRA, and a new option is for landowners in Fayette and Hardeman counties, again, those core counties, and then the other the other positive counties where CWD exists at a low prevalence within a certain radius of the areas, those isolated areas that we know that have CWD. Those landowners can get one of these control permits to harvest deer outside of deer season. So that's a new option for landowners in the affected area. Some next steps for CWD, some new program components that we have is a density estimation that we're beginning to do. We're going to be doing some aerial work where we estimate deer populations so that we can better know what deer densities are and such, and then we can track those over time to evaluate our management and to do the best job that we can. And then we're also beginning a targeted removal program where we're working with private landowners in those areas of isolated CWD in those low prevalence counties. With landowner permission, we're going to work with those landowners to harvest additional deer in addition to those taken by hunters during deer season, to try to lower the deer densities there and hopefully lower prevalence and hopefully make CWD less of a factor in those areas. And then another thing that's pretty big for us right now is transitioning the diagnostics work that is done, the testing, the sampling. We partner with labs to do that. We've got an in-state lab at the Department of Agriculture known as Cord Lab that's beginning to do that testing for us. So we'll be partnering with them along with Colorado State again this year to do that work. Another thing, and this is how I'll end the presentation, we're still managing the disposal issue. That's still a significant issue for us because the affected area, we can't take deer to landfills in that area. And we have processors and other stakeholders that need a responsible outlet for disposal. So anyway, we're still in the process of getting an incinerator at the Fayette County landfill, and that will be the future. But until then, we are operating another carcass management site. This year, that will occur at Chickasaw Wildlife Management Area as opposed to Wolf River where it was in the past. So anyway, that's the highlights of the changes, and look forward to the next few minutes for the questions and answers. And thanks again for joining us, and I hope that you learned a lot of good information. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chuck. I think that was a good overview, and we're going to start with some of the questions that came in prior to the meeting, and that's where we'll start today. And then we'll jump into some others, and I know a lot of folks are online. Appreciate y'all tuning in. Questions are being answered in the comments, and we'll try to get to some more of those later live if possible. So let's start with number one. I think this is going to go to Dan. What are the main scientific sources, studies, et cetera, that the TWRA and the Commission are using to put together their response to CWD?
Yeah, that's a good question, Jason. CWD was first identified roughly 40 years ago now as what actually causes the disease, I should say. It was first recognized in the late 60s. But in the last 40 years, there's over 650 peer-reviewed journal articles that we pull our information from at this point in time, you know, and they all kind of build upon each other. Even just this year, there was a recent one that came out on harvest strategy relative to controlling the disease. And that was based on 16 to 18 years worth of data out of Colorado. There are resources available out there. I don't believe we currently have a bibliography on the TWA website, but that information is available on the CWD Alliance webpage. They have a running bibliography that's available. People can always use Google Scholar to look up the current information and even past information. And so it's kind of hard to pinpoint one specific article or even a series of articles. At the end of my presentations, I usually have a list of references of about 40 or 50 different references that I've pulled on and drawn on. Where we actually get a lot of our management post-discovery has been from the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies Best Management Practices. And that document is actually available online on their website under the Wildlife Health Committee. And that was put together in conjunction with basically all of the CWD experts working for wildlife agencies. That document came out in 2018 and has actually recently been updated just since then. And so there's a lot of good information and a good list of references at the end of that document. But in terms of a lot of the things that we're looking at for management strategies as well as disposal options and things like that have come from that particular document.
Great. Thank you for that. All right, the next question that came in was, what is the current population of buck to doe ratio objective in unit CWD, and how does that compare to the same goals pre-CWD? And another part of that question, is there an actual goal, or is it just to get it as low as possible?
That's a really good question. Currently, there is not a population size objective, nor is there a buck-doe ratio objective in unit CWD. The goal is to manage for the lowest prevalence possible, and that requires that the population density, population size are lowered, and also that the buck-doe ratio is decreased, and also that the buck age structure is decreased. So that's what we're working for right now, is to decrease those. One of the new programs that we're implementing, measuring the density over time, is going to allow us to document those changes in relation to prevalence. And so we'll be able to document those changes and look at how successful we are as prevalence changes over time. So we'll be able to document those changes. Thanks for that question.
Hey, Jason.
Yes.
Real quick, I wanted to add to that. You know, the things that Steph just described are best management practices that we've learned from all those scientific sources that Dan referred to, and then guidance from other states that have been dealing with this issue for decades. And then guidance from like the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So we've got a really good background from other sources that's helping us or helping guide our management. And then also I wanted to add that Steph's a new face probably to the folks that have followed us about chronic wasting disease. So I wanted to welcome her. She's doing a terrific job, as you could tell just by that response. So glad she's here with us, and really appreciate the good work she's doing.
Thanks for that addition, Chuck. Yeah, she's been great. I've worked with her quite a bit here recently, and it's been fun. So doing good work. All right, Chuck, I think this one's going to come to you. What is the plan for CWD when it spreads throughout most of the state, or when it is discovered in other areas of the state? Will the goal then be to drastically reduce the herd statewide, or let it go up? Good question.
Well, I start with our goal is to keep that from happening. You know, ideally that wouldn't happen. We've got a significant chronic wasting disease issue in Tennessee, but one of our number one goal is to keep this from affecting the rest of the state. So we want to prevent the spread, and when I say spread, I mean spread outwardly. But I also mean that we don't want it to move or be moved to a new area of the state. Now, there is a chance that could occur. You know, just like it occurred in West Tennessee, it could happen in East Tennessee. We hope that doesn't happen. But if it does, you're going to see an equivalent response in that part of the state. So you'll see regulations that will change. You'll see the hunting opportunities change, and then you'll see an increase effort to do intensive monitoring there. Because if it happens there, just like in West Tennessee, we're going to want to know as quickly as we can how much is there and exactly where it is, so that we can stay on top of it. But the number one thing is to try to keep that from happening. But that's something we have to prepare ourselves for, and we are.
Chuck, I'll add on to that if you guys don't mind.
Sure.
I just to kind of get into how we actually do the surveillance. I mean, we have goals set for every county in the state, and for the last 2 years, we've actually met those goals for each county. And we've altered the goals for our known endemic area, but we are still continuing to do surveillance, and we will continue to do surveillance throughout the rest of the state. And so we're getting a better picture of if it does exist somewhere else in the state at this point in time. It's at a percentage that's really, really low, and it's not going to be the same scenario that what we've discovered in the southwest portion of the state. So it's just something to keep in mind for folks, that the disease itself and what we've learned from other states that started out with that at a much lower prevalence, it doesn't rapidly move across the landscape. It's all relative to deer contact. So, a deer in southwest Tennessee, it's not going to make it all the way over to East Tennessee of its own accord, and not have something else happen, especially if it was an infected animal. That's not usually how the disease gets moved long distances. It may slowly but surely trickle out from that area, but as Chuck mentioned, with hunting regulation changes and concerted efforts, hopefully we can contain it with the area that we already know that it's at. But that's why the regulations of carcass movement and things like that are so critical, because even though the animal's dead, you're moving that infectious material, and that material somewhere else gets put on the landscape somewhere else in the state. That could actually lead to a new area of infection somewhere else in the state. And so that's why, the regulations, there is logic behind them, and it is to prevent the movement of that material, since, as we know, prions are indefinite on the landscape. At this point in time, we're 20, 30 years out on some of the areas that have had CWD, and the environment does play a role in reinfection, and that's where those carcass parts ending up on the landscape becomes a problem. So,
Thank you, Dan. Chuck, I think this is going to come to you again as well. How are the particular concerns of the hunters in Unit CWD being accounted for, or are we expected to give 100% of this issue for the rest of the hunters in Tennessee with no regard for our preferences, or is this going to be give and take?
Well, our biggest ally in managing CWD is hunters, but also landowners. So we are constantly accounting for the preferences of hunters. So we're doing that through direct contacts like Timon. We've got him here today. He's one of the local wildlife officers in this area, and he's constantly hearing from hunters and sharing that information with me and the others on this team, and we account for that every single day. And we're also surveying landowners, surveying hunters in that area to make sure that we know their opinions and their attitudes on this subject. And that's we're learning that information. We're seriously, feverishly gaining that information, accounting for it. Our commission's really serious about accounting for those hunters' preferences as well. And so all the way up to the commission level where they decide exactly what the regulations will be, that's being accounted for. And it's challenging because a lot of the management actions that it takes to effectively manage CWD contradict with some of the preferences, say, in the last 15 years of hunters. So really, I encourage folks, hunters in the positive counties, especially Hardeman and Fayette, to realize that if if we're going to keep the number of infected deer to a minimum, which is one of our goals, is that that's going to require a lower deer density, a younger deer population. And I think those hunters will agree, and at least they lots of them tell me that, you know, they want to manage in a way, and they want to harvest in a way so that if you've got 10 deer on your property, that as few of them are positive as possible. And that's what we're trying to accomplish, and man, we're factoring in those hunter preferences in every step we take.
Thanks, Chuck.
I'll add on to that a little bit. I think it's important to note that where we're at now that we've got 2 years worth of data under our belt, we've got a really bad problem. And so the hunting regulations may seem drastic, like they just all of a sudden got opened up. But the reality is there's not the time that other states have had to kind of build up and ramp up with CWD management. We're in certain pockets within our endemic area, we're at the same level where Wisconsin is in some of their area that they've known they had the disease for 20 plus years at this point in time. And so we don't have the luxury of just kind of holding off and at low prevalences and kind of manipulating harvest schemes and trying to manage the disease at that level. You know, I think in total we're well over, between the two seasons, 2018 to now, we're, you know, at over 670 positive animals, and that's a lot on the landscape. You know, most states, when they first find it and identify the disease, you find where it's like in one area and at most maybe 10 to 15 animals after you do intensive surveillance. And we're not in that scenario. We're much further along, which means the options that we have become a little bit more limited in the core area. But and so the things we're instituting are multiple levels of the, you know, as you move out from that core area, the prevalences do get lower, so we have more options the further out from the core area you get. But, you know, you've got more drastic options whenever you have a much higher prevalence to start with. So,
And one quick follow-up is that, you know, these, for example, the hunting regulation changes. Ultimately, the hunter and the landowner still have a personal choice on how they manage the properties that they hunt or manage. So ultimately, it comes down to them. It's not a forced action. And so we're just inviting those landowners and hunters to align with the agency to manage this in the best way we know how, but they still have that choice.
All right. Next question. Dan, your name's on this one. Why would it be considered preferable to have a deer population so low in my immediate area that to have a quality hunting experience, both for a deer sighting and trophy quality standpoint, that I have to drive several hours to hunt rather than to have a decent population with a high percentage of CWD positive in my area?
it's a good question. When it comes down to it, you know, CWD is spread in multiple ways, and one of the primary ways is direct contact with other animals. And so whenever you decrease the population in an area, you decrease the chances for an infected animal to come in contact with uninfected animals and spread the disease. We know that the disease doesn't distribute evenly across the landscape because it tends to be spread far distances by bucks that are positive because they tend to migrate further out than does do. But does have a very specific home range, so once it's introduced into a very specific group of does, it'll spread amongst them because they're constantly interacting through mutual grooming, shared feeding sites, you know, all kinds of different activities of just normal social behavior. And so if you are wanting to successfully remove animals from the landscape that are infected, you're going to need to remove a lot of the animals in a given area where you know the disease is, just to prevent those mechanisms from happening. The other mechanism that doesn't necessarily occur when you have low prevalences at a high rate, but is the environmental transmission cycle. And so once you have an area that has a fairly high prevalence, and when I say fairly high, I mean 10% or greater prevalence in any given age or sex class, you start to have environmental transmission occurring at some level because the prions, as I mentioned before, they remain infectious even once in the environment. And so the more animals that you have on the landscape that become positive, the more likely you are to have that environmental transmission cycle, which we don't have any mechanisms at this point in time to stop the environmental transmission. So the best way to prevent that environmental transmission is to prevent the prevalences from getting to the point where the environment becomes a problem. And so keeping prevalences low will help with that environmental contamination component of this, because, you know, we focus most of our efforts on deer because that's what we have techniques and tools for managing at this point in time. And in the absence of environmental mitigation, that's where we have to focus our efforts, is on the things that we can control. So I hope that answers the question appropriately.
Yes. All right. One other question here. Stephanie, I think you may take this one. I know that TWRA was trying to sample as many deer as possible last season in order to learn as much as possible about the extent of CWD in West Tennessee. Did you get enough samples, and what did you end up learning?
Yeah, we were really successful last year. We had a lot of help from hunters, from meat processors and taxidermists, and we were able to sample a lot of deer. Statewide, we sampled over 14,000 deer. 10,000 of those deer came from the core area. Just under 500 deer came back positive, and the vast majority were from Fayette and Hardeman County, unfortunately. They're the most heavily impacted counties. And so we were able to calculate the prevalence in Fayette County of just under 14% and Hardeman County at about 8%. The surrounding counties were all less than 1%. So we got really good information that we were able to calculate, and that was the information that we needed. So thanks very much for the generous help from all the people that contributed. We were able to get the information that we needed. So
I'll add to that some of the other things that we've realized from those prevalence rates, those high rates in Hardeman and Fayette County, is that it's possible that prevalence is high enough there that it's affecting the population significantly. Okay, it could already be to the point there where they're experiencing a younger deer population there. We know that's indicative of other states that have had CWD for a long time and those that have been at high prevalence. We know that the disease will result in a younger deer population and a lower deer population. And it's possible that maybe not countywide, but it's certainly in the area where it's most concentrated there on the Hardeman and Fayette County border, that it could be having those population level effects, and that we know without a doubt that the environment there is causing some of the infections. In other words, it could be passed from the environment to the deer, and that doesn't happen at the lowest prevalences. Maybe some, but it definitely is in those counties. Unfortunately, it's playing a role in transmitting the disease.
Yeah, and one other thing to add to that is that, you know, when we report the countywide prevalences, you know, the way you determine a prevalence is the number of animals you sample in an area and the number of those that are positive out of that subset relative to the number that didn't test positive, or in our case, not detected. And so that's a countywide prevalence, but within Fayette and Hardeman County, like Chuck mentioned, in that area where there's a higher concentration, the prevalences in those areas are actually going to be much higher than that 10% or that 12% that's reported for the county level. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Depending on where you're hunting, those prevalences will actually change within a county, but we didn't necessarily get enough of the non-detect locations to be able to narrow in our focus and be able to report out at less than a county level, because that's the minimum size range that we actually collect the data by. One other thing to mention with regards to when Stephanie was reporting those results, you know, if you follow along and you look at, wow, we went from 185 positives the first year to 400 plus positives the next year, you know, that's, people will think, whoa, it's getting really bad really quick. But the reality is we altered our surveillance intentionally to be able to pick up a much finer scale as to what's going on in the landscape. And so by increasing our sampling effort, especially in the peripheral counties to Fayette and Hardeman, we're able to pick up on those lower prevalences and be able to pick up the disease. And so the disease, when you first find it in an area that wasn't known to have it, it didn't just get there that day or that year. Typically it's gonna have been there for multiple years by the time you find that first positive. So just keep that in mind, that we've really, that sampling, those 2 years, we say 2 years, but that really occurred within a 12 to 13 month period. And so that really just represents 1 year's worth of data, kind of in a sense. And so we just have a really good idea of what's going on now. And even if, that kind of moves out a little bit this year, it kind of goes back to the fact that it's not rapidly expanding. It just seems that way because we're intentionally trying to find it at a much smaller scale. So it's just one of those things to kind of keep in mind.
Okay.
Just to add on to that, one last thing is the reason that we were able to do that is because so many hunters participated and submitted their deer heads for testing. And so we really encourage everybody to submit your samples for testing. That allows us to be able to test these deer and to get more information about the spread of the disease. So that's what you can do.
Perfect. Yeah, that kind of leads me to my next question. Jeremy, your boots on the ground, what can people do? How can people submit their deer for sampling, and what's the protocols there?
Yeah, so we partner with the majority of meat processors and taxidermists in Unit CWD. So we obtain samples that way. We also have a sample drop-off container program that's designed for folks who do at-home processing. There's approximately 30, I believe it's 32 of those locations in the unit. So we encourage folks to use those. You can find a list of the drop-off locations on the CWD section of the TWRA website. They're all on there. There's a nice interactive map so you can find those locations.
I'm going to add to that too. The CDC recommends that in areas that to have CWD, to have your deer tested before you consume it, and that if it tests positive, to not eat it. And that's TWRA's recommendation as well. So that's what we recommend in the CWD affected area of Tennessee. Now, outside of that area, like for example in Region 2, 3, and 4, we don't have that same recommendation statewide. However, if a hunter's really passionate about this, there are opportunities in Region 2, 3, and 4. You can refer to our website for the details as to where. But there are a few locations that you can have it sampled. And then on the major hunting weekends, like your opener of muzzleloader and gun, our staff do CWD sampling at a lot of processors and other areas where hunters gather. So anyway, there's an opportunity there, but we don't go as far as to recommend it statewide, but certainly in the affected area.
Well, that kind of leads me to my next question, and piggyback on this a little bit, but how can hunters help manage CWD inside and outside the affected areas? You pretty much answered that, but anything else you want to add on how you could manage inside and outside the area?
I'd add to it, just encourage folks to report sick deer through our website. We get reports from the affected area as well as from other areas in West Tennessee and statewide. So we try to manage as many of those as possible, and it's a really valuable tool when we talk about early detection if it were to spread. So I'd encourage people to use that.
Okay.
Just one thing on that, just keep in mind that not every report is going to necessarily have somebody come out to it, unfortunately. There's just not necessarily the capability to do that. And there's a set of guidelines based on likelihood to be CWD that we kind of follow for that. Because, you get all kinds of hit by car reports and things like that throughout the state. So, but definitely report them, and then, make every effort when possible to try and get samples from animals that kind of fit the bill for potential CWD.
I'd like to add that statewide, I'll speak to it outside of the positive area. A preventative measure that landowners and hunters can take is to not allow deer densities to get high. So your lower deer densities will help. That that's extremely important. If CWD is introduced to an area, if you've got a high deer density, it's fuel to the fire. And so to be proactive, to not allow deer densities to get high, and that doesn't mean that you can't have a huntable sized population that hunters would enjoy hunting. I mean, they certainly still can. So definitely recommend that, and no feeding of deer, minerals. If you want to try to keep this disease from spreading, you don't want to concentrate them. So any management action you could take to not concentrate deer is going to be helpful to decrease prevalence if it exists in an area, or to keep it from having a large-scale impact.
I'm glad you bring that up. Ty, let's jump to you on this one. What are the rules and recommendations about feeding deer, and what should you do if you have an old salt or mineral site on your property?
It's a commonly asked question. Inside the CWD positive and high-risk counties, it's illegal to put out any type of grain, salt, minerals, or any type of attractant for the animals. However, you can put it out if it's within 100 feet of an occupied dwelling or residence, or if it's a normal agricultural practice. But to kind of go back to what Chuck was talking about earlier, if you have an old existing salt lick mineral block that's been out for years, there's nothing wrong with leaving it out by law. It's perfectly fine. However, it would be best if you could cover that up to keep the deer from using that to help keep the spread down.
Cool. All right, let's go to this question. Is the in-state testing facility operational yet? Ty, do you care to take that one?
Sure. Tennessee Department of Agriculture is ramping up a testing facility that will soon be operational. We anticipate that some deer will be tested this year, and hopefully the bulk of the deer will be tested next year.
Okay, and then on those same lines, let's see here. I had another question, I thought. Yeah, okay. What are the meat processors and taxidermists? What will they expect, or will they be accepting deer in the CWD affected area this year?
Yes, and a list of those can be found on TWRA's website if you look at the CWD section.
Okay.
Can I turn that around just a little bit, that question back to Jeremy too? I'm curious if you, have there been any changes in what processors are operating this year as opposed to last year? I know a lot of hunters wonder if they're doing okay, if they're going to be there again this year.
For the most part, we're dealing with the same group. There may be one or two that have maybe changed their operation a bit, but for the most part, we're dealing with the same group of processors. And I want to make it clear that the list on our website of processors and taxidermists, especially from the taxidermist standpoint, is not necessarily an exhaustive list for every single individual, but it is most of them. But
So the outlook's still good for processors in that area?
yes.
Good.
Yep.
All right, I want to ask a couple more questions off that we've got beforehand, and then we'll jump to some that's coming in online. Stephanie, probably throw these at you. I'm going to lump these together. Is TWR offering free testing this season, and what might be the turnaround times, and how will they be notified?
Okay. So sampling is free statewide, testing is free statewide. Turnaround times we are anticipating will be a week is our plan. What you can do to make your turnaround time as short as possible is make sure that we have your most current phone number and your most current email address. You'll be notified by text message if we have it, or email address. And so the best way to make sure that we get a hold of you as quickly as possible is to make sure we have the correct information. We have been exhaustive during the off-season in streamlining every step of the way, from when you drop the sample off through the sampling process, shipping, location identification, making sure that you give a good location on your sample, and then the notification process so that we can shorten that turnaround time. We understand everybody wants to know as soon as possible, so we are making sure that we're shortening it as much as we possibly can. But we do need your help, so make sure you give us good locations and make sure that we have your contact information. Be prepared. There can be problems right around the holidays and right after the opener, so there may be a little bit of a slowdown, but we really are, we've heard you guys. Everybody wants to know as soon as possible, so we're shortening that as much as we can.
So if our hunters have any questions about their contact information, if they'll go on the TWRA website, go into our licensing system where they get their licenses.
GoOutdoorsTennessee.com.
Thank you. And then they can, that their profile is there. They can update that accordingly.
Perfect. I was going to say that same thing. And another website to keep in mind, CWDandTennessee.com, for all this information that we're talking about today. Great. Okay.
Just one last little thing on that.
Go ahead.
Just be aware we are still in a pandemic. And so right now the labs have their operating protocols, but that would be a confounding issue should something come up that might slow the process down, if it's relative to the pandemic with the labs that we're choosing to use. And I think pretty much every state's kind of in that scenario. So that might be something we try to foresee everything that might be a problem. Last year there was a snowstorm that impacted turnaround time at the lab got shut down because they got dumped on with 4 or 5 feet of snow at once. There's going to be those things that are potential, but we'll try and update folks to let them know that these things are occurring so that they can anticipate that there will be delays in the results. We do our best to improve communications on that front.
And it is 2020, so there's that.
It's one of those years. Okay, here's some questions that are coming in online, and we'll just throw these out and let you guys divvy them up how you want to. How do processors conduct business in positive counties? Do they hold a deer until they get the results, or do they process everything as they get it?
Jeremy, would you please take that one, and I'll help if needed. Thank you. Well, processors, when they basically they process deer as they come in. Of course, most of them are working with us to pull samples, and of course we process those and whatnot. But the testing turnaround time is usually longer than it takes for the animal to be processed. So, if anybody else wants to add to that?
Well, I'll just point out that the processors are a huge component of CWD management, and TWRA wants to do all we can to help them with this challenge, and I encourage hunters to do the same. But those processors, as Jeremy alluded to, they have done an excellent job at helping us know what we know about CWD. The spatial distribution, the prevalences that we're able to share and use for decision making. A lot of that information came through partnerships with those processors, and Jeremy and his staff have done an amazing job establishing those and developing those relationships that have helped so much. So just wanted to emphasize the importance of them and reshare that commitment that we have to helping support them.
I'll just add into that. Every processor is their own individual business, and my recommendation's always been, talk to the person that's going to be handling your animal. Talk to your processor before you even go out to the field to hunt. Know what they're going to do and what they're not going to do, and if you have concerns, and work with them if they can address them. If they can't, then just make an informed decision based on a conversation with folks. Little subtle things that people don't think about. Don't have your meat ground, because a lot of times it's ground together, things like that. If you just get whole cuts of meat, and then you're not having to worry about some of those other issues. So, but again, just have a conversation with your processor prior to going out to the field and harvesting an animal. It's going to be your best bet.
Good tip. All right. Another question coming in online. Why are carcass transport rules inconsistent with adjoining states? Some states allow transport as long as skull and spine are removed. Tennessee requires deboning. You may want to take that one.
Folks are looking around, so I'll try to help here. So, each state has differences, and some of that's differences in hunter preferences. our regulation that we have is based on a lot of science, best management practices that have been developed, and we just follow those as closely as we possibly can. I can't speak to why some states may not take the same measures that we're taking, but that's the basis for what we have. And then, so one of the things we want to be mindful of as well is just what is practical. What can hunters actually accomplish and do? And so, because we want to set regulations up that are effective for managing CWD, but that are also, can easily be followed by hunters. And when it comes to preparing a carcass, it gets pretty tricky because some of those things are pretty technical, and it's just hard work. So anyway, it's balancing the wise management and the ability for hunters to be able to follow those regulations without too much hardship.
And to kind of add on to Chuck kind of touched base on it, the reason why we've chosen to not allow brain matter or spinal cord in is because that's where the highest concentration of the prions are. And so by allowing those things to come in, you're allowing the most contaminated part of a carcass to come into the state. And so that's kind of the logic behind having all those things removed. In addition, the next highest concentration of prions tends to exist in the lymph nodes. And so boned out carcasses, typically all that material has been removed. And so you're not bringing that material back with you, because you're just bringing back the meat, which has a lower concentration potentially of that, and it's less likely to end up on the landscape. Most people, if they find out their animal is positive, they're probably not going to take their boned out meat and just pitch it in their backyard. They're probably just going to throw it away in the regular trash. But a whole carcass that comes back, or any major part of that, might end up on the landscape. And because those higher concentrations of prions do exist in the spinal cord and in the brain, that's primarily why we don't want those parts coming back in without having received some sort of cleaning or treatment or otherwise.
Along those same lines, what's going on in Arkansas and Mississippi? That was one of the questions that came in beforehand. What's going on in those states nearby in that CWD unit?
Much like Tennessee, both Arkansas and Mississippi are working to increase harvest and participation and improve surveillance across their states. The extent of the disease in each state remains much the same.
All right.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that.
Sure.
And Jason, you may just have to say no more talking, Chuck.
No, you're good.
Because
You're good.
I'm doing a lot of this. But, something that's been important is for us to be on the same page with those states. They're doing a good job with management, and we want to be on the same page with that, and we do. So one thing that we're doing to ensure that, we actually meet with those states monthly now to compare notes and learn from one another. And I concur with what Ty shared there about we're all lined up with our priorities and working together as best we can.
Good. All right. Another question from online. How long does it take for a deer to show signs once they become positive? I bet this is a Dan question.
Yeah, on average, it's about 10 to 18 months. So if an animal got infected today, it may not even be showing clinical signs next year at this point in time. So it's about 10 to 18 months based on the studies in both wild populations as well as in captivity. And that's specifically for white-tailed deer. It varies the species that you're looking at, but in general for white-tailed deer, it's about 10 to 18 months, which is why it's kind of if you're just looking for I'll kind of ramble on a little bit, but if you're just looking for clinical signs, that's a good indicator for us, but that animal's probably had the disease for a while and been on the landscape for a while and shedding those prions for a while, because it pretty much is shedding every excretion that comes out of that animal. And a lot of the animals that we actually get that test positive are apparently healthy looking hunter harvested animals. So just looking at an animal, you're not gonna be able to know if it actually has the disease or not.
Okay. This kind of piggybacks on a question we answered earlier. Ty, this probably come right back to you. Why is feeding allowed within 100 feet from a residence? You mentioned that earlier.
Deer normally don't come within 100 yards of a residence, so it's really not that big a concern. However, some instances, like if you're around cities or suburb area, deer are pretty docile animals. So if you get into a situation like that, I'd recommend not feeding them if they're coming up to your house.
Another goal we have is
Yeah.
to not be overly restrictive with our regulations, and, you know, we didn't want to do anything to prohibit bird feeding or any of those other activities that stakeholders enjoy, so that's another reason.
All right. Last question I've got from online right now. If prions, did I say that right? Prions, Dan? If prions are present in the environment, should we not bring mud or dirt from positive counties to other counties?
It's a good question. The ability for that to transfer disease has not been determined, that mechanism, by moving dirt from that. I always recommend, if you're going and hunting or doing outdoor activities in an area that's known to have a high level of disease, to clean your equipment off before you leave that area. And we actually do that as a practice when we're working check stations and things like that. Is we don't use the same equipment in the zone that we do elsewhere in the state. And so basically it's a good practice to be in, realizing that it's also not practical for many purposes. You know, things are being moved, construction equipment, all that kind of stuff is being moved on a regular basis. So basically all we can do is recommend that, yes, it gets cleaned off, but there's not regulations enforcing that.
Okay. All right. Sure.
There's also less likelihood of, say, construction dirt or material like that, fill dirt, that has less potential to attract deer to an area. So if that's just moved as part of construction work or something like that, that has very little likelihood of attracting deer to an area, whereas, and it also has less likelihood of having high concentrations of prions. Whereas if you have, say, a mineral lick or something like that, it's probably going to have high concentrations of prions if it's in an infected area, if it's moved to an infected area, and then if it has deer excretions of some sort, it's going to attract deer. And so that is more likely to contain infectious material and also attract deer. So generally, construction activities are not going to do that, but so it's the likelihood is probably pretty low.
Thank you for that addition. All right, let's move to the next one. This is one that we had already prepared. Jeremy, this is probably going to go to you. How many deer were killed in the August hunt? And did adding guns make a difference? How many deer tested positive?
All right, good question. Yeah, the harvest was up considerably for the August hunt. It increased by approximately 155% in unit CWD. So I'd say the addition of being able to use a rifle did make a difference. The harvest was about 800 statewide. To date, we've tested about 100 from Region 1, and most of those came from Unit CWD, and right now we have 8 new positives from August. They're all within the same core area, Fayette and Hardeman counties. So,
One thing to note on that, the 155% increase doesn't necessarily mean a biologically significant increase, because it's spread out across about 4,500 square miles. So yeah, it's great, and it did increase hunter success and things like that. But relative to disease management, it may not have as much of an impact as what 155% sounds like, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, another question coming in online. How long does CWD take to kill a deer?
On average, it's that 10 to 18 month period. By the time they start showing clinical signs, you're looking at that animal will probably be dead within a couple of months of exhibiting actual noticeable clinical signs. Especially, if they're starting to be the really skinny kind of classic deer with poor hair coat and everything, they're on their way out at that point in time. There are quote unquote deer with resistance genes, as people like to call it, which is a little bit of a misnomer, because they still get infected with the disease, but they just stay on the landscape for a little bit longer. So those deer might be on the landscape for post initial contact infection, whatever you want to call it, they might be in the landscape for up to 24 months potentially during that time period. So, and
Okay.
again, we're just talking about deer because we don't want to get into elk and all that other kind of stuff because those numbers start to change depending on which species you're specifically talking about.
One thing I find fascinating about CWD is that what he just described, a lot of the deer that get infected with CWD ultimately die from another cause because CWD makes them more susceptible to death by other causes. For example, getting hit by a car, getting harvested by a hunter, getting preyed upon, and it's just it's always been a really intriguing piece about CWD to me.
If you really want to get into the weeds on it, Chuck, there's a lot of evidence that animals actually die secondary to aspiration pneumonia a lot of times with CWD because they're no longer able to swallow correctly, and they end up getting a pneumonia, and then that actually leads to their ultimate demise as a result of being infected with the prions.
And
Because
this
it's
is-
impacting the neurologic.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And this is one of the reasons we don't, people regularly ask us, well, why don't we see these emaciated deer throughout Hardeman and Fayette counties if it's a high prevalence area? And that's exactly why, because a lot of those deer are dying of other causes.
Yeah, well, that and, I think we've all gotten accustomed, we're in a southeastern state, we're accustomed to hemorrhagic disease outbreaks, which is caused by a virus that's spread by a midge and not related to CWD. But we're used to seeing a lot of dead deer whenever we have an outbreak of that disease, because they all get infected at the same time, and the disease course is pretty much similar in those animals at that point in time. With chronic wasting disease, they don't all get infected on the same day. They don't get all infected at the same rate. And there is that variability of 10 to 18 months before they show clinical signs. And it depends on the age that they're at when they become infected, all kinds of different factors. And so, whereas you're used to seeing those hemorrhagic disease, the virus outbreaks that we see associated with that we've seen here for decades, those are all really acute and they cycle out. But with CWD, it's year round where they're being infected potentially, so they're going to die at different times. And when they die at different times, it might be one here, one there, and you won't recognize it or pick up on it. And when only one animal's dying at a time, they're scavenged really quickly. But you have 30 animals die around a watering hole. Scavengers, there's not enough scavengers in the area to clean up that really fast. So you're picking up on it more readily. So there's a bunch of different factors that are involved. But ultimately, if you were to let them and you prevented all the other factors, it will eventually kill them because the damage to the brain is permanent and irreversible.
All right. Another question coming in about feeding. Is there any evidence that the feeding of minerals in the off-season make a deer healthier or less likely to get CWD?
No.
All right.
That's why we call him the expert. He's an expert. When we started, I was picking on Dan about being an expert. He's a very humble guy, and he doesn't like to be called an expert. He's a specialist. So, thank you, Dr. Specialist.
If you want a little bit more on that, what we have actually shown is that those mineral sites are actually a place where, depending on the minerals that are present, actually make the deer more likely to get the disease at those sites.
Yep.
So,
All right. Okay, I got a couple more here that I wanted to make sure we hit on. What happened to the carcass management site at the Wolf River WMA? You want to touch on that one, Jeremy, I guess?
I'll take that one.
Awesome.
Yeah, the Wolf River site was managed and operated during the 2019 to 2020 deer season. It was conducted based on partnership and best practices from Department of Agriculture and Department of Environment and Conservation. It was meant to be a temporary one-season site, and following the hunting season, it was closed permanently according to the management practices. And this year, if you wanted me to talk about maybe what we're going to do this year on the
That'll be
disposal
my next
front,
question.
we'll operate a similar site with the same partnership with TDEC and Department of Agriculture. It will be a Chickasaw Wildlife Management Area in Hardeman County. And then going forward, a commercial incinerator is being planned and established and will be installed at a different location, which will be in Fayette County.
Awesome. Perfect.
Jason, can I go back just a little?
You can.
Now Chuck's got me wanting to explain a
Yeah.
little more on one of the other questions.
Easy now.
Yeah. Back to the mineral question.
Sure.
You know, I think people look at, when we say infection, they look at it as, you know, we're in the middle of COVID, and I don't want to relate things to COVID, but you look at, you know, you get a cold, you feel it, you know you're sick with something. That's a standard infection because your immune system is reacting to it, and the signs that you feel are actually a result of what your immune system is doing. The reality is that CWD produces very little to no immune response within the body. And so by providing supplements and nutrition and all those kind of things, that would help bolster your immune system. But the immune system isn't fighting this because the body doesn't recognize it as something being abnormal. And so, because it's just an abnormal form of the normal protein. And so, like, these kind of concepts that we have for normal infectious diseases, viruses, bacteria, fungus, and things like that, they don't apply to prions because they don't act in the same way and cause the same changes in the body. So these kind of things that we would do, you know, take your vitamin C and drink your orange juice and all that other kind of stuff that you've been told for all these years to boost your immune system, is not going to necessarily help with this particular disease. And they've actually done some extensive but studies. There's one recently published out of Colorado where they looked at these supplements and things like that to provide the animals, and there was zero impact on whether or not the animal got the disease, for one, and then in addition to that actually died from the disease.
All right. I've got, I think, about 2 questions here, maybe just one. I think we've already touched on this one, and then we'll probably wrapping it up if nothing else comes in online. Dan, you mentioned earlier that we are testing some, or we have been doing surveillance. Will you talk about that a little bit more? Are we testing anywhere else in the state of Tennessee?
Yeah, there are surveillance goals set for every county in the state. We've set it at countywide level. It's a weight-based surveillance. Primarily in the parts of the state that are not in what, you know, TWA Region 1, where our CWD endemic area is. All those other counties, that surveillance is probably occurring at some level through processors and taxidermists. And I would have to look to somebody. Do we know, are we actually doing check stations with COVID, would be my question. I hadn't heard we weren't doing those. We just aren't doing the mandatory ones in Unit CWD. But historically, in the absence of COVID, opening weekends of muzzleloader and rifle season in the rest of the state is when the bulk of that sampling occurs. And in order to meet the other goals, if they aren't met during that weekend, we work in conjunction with processors and taxidermists, as well as our targeted surveillance samples, which we do throughout the course of the year. So when we talk about our surveillance, it's actually, we meet our goals in a year-long cycle, and that cycle starts on July 1 and ends June 30. So any of the reports or anything you hear about CWD and numbers, that's kind of the cycle. So, but the bulk of our sampling does occur with hunter harvest in the fall. So
We have evaluated risk in every county, and we've set sampling goals based on the risk that we found for each county. So it's a very sophisticated way of trying to detect a disease, and that's what we do.
yeah, and that evaluation was done by Cornell in 2017 and 2018. That is actually available, or it was available on the website, but that is available as a public document for anybody who's interested in that risk assessment that was initially done. And each year we reassess and make adjustments to it as needed based on things that we find here in the state as well as things we find in our adjacent states. So.
Okay, had another one come in online. This is around minerals again. Does using bleach around existing mineral sites help minimize the prions?
At this point in time, there's not any research to support that. Unfortunately, most of the chemicals that we use are actually inactivated in the presence of organic matter. So if you were to take just the pure prion and apply a 40% or greater bleach solution to it, like if it was on a stainless steel table, that would destroy that prion. But if you apply that to the environment, all the other things that are in the soil, all the microbes, all of the clays, all of the other components of soil would actually inactivate that bleach before it actually destroyed the prion, because it's based on contact time with that prey on. And so, like, it's not necessarily going to do much for you. It's pretty much probably going to be inactivated as soon as it hits the soil.
All right. Last question I have, unless something else comes in online. I appreciate everybody tuning in and taking part today. Stephanie, I'm going to send this one to you. Is TWRA planning to remove deer in areas near new positives?
The short answer is yes. There are 4 positives that are at the northeast and northern leading edge of the affected area of CWD. And around those areas, we are planning to remove deer after hunting season. We will be working collaboratively with Wildlife Services to reduce deer densities and also remove as many of the positive deer in that area as we possibly can. This is a best management practice. We want to handle this as swiftly as we possibly can and get ahead of the infection. We really think this is the leading edge of the infection of the affected area, and we want to remove as many positives as possible. Like Chuck talked about earlier, we'll be monitoring the density in the area, and so we'll be able to see what impact we have on the density of deer in the area and also what impact we have on the infection in the area over time. So we'll be able to look at the impact we have, but we will be targeting, we'll be doing targeted removal of deer in the area. We'll be working with willing landowners, so this isn't anything that's mandatory. It's only with willing landowners, and we'll be doing it after hunting season in a very safe, targeted, possible way so that we can try and get ahead of the infection and limit the spread. Chuck looks like he has something.
I'm not going to say anything about that. Steph did a great job with that, but I feel like we're nearing the finish line here. And before we wrap, I want to thank my fellow colleagues here for their help. This was a really good experience. You guys did great. Thanks so much. I know some of you traveled a long ways to get here. And if this were a normal meeting, I'd ask for a round of applause, but it would just be weird because there's nobody to applaud. But anyway. You certainly deserve it. Thanks so much, everybody. You did fantastic.
Yeah, it was great.
Thank you,
Everything's
Jason,
going well.
and the rest, and the communication staff that we have here too. You guys are always great. Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Well, let's just wrap it up with this. One last question. What is the number one thing people can do to help fight against CWD? The number one thing.
The number one thing. I would say this year, take one more deer if you're in Unit CWD and provide that for sampling and continue helping the agency have as much information as we can to best management or for best management, and to be proactive and take those actions that each individual hunter and landowner can take to help us.
All right. Well, I appreciate everybody tuning in online. I appreciate this panel. Great work. Yes, archery season opens this weekend, so make sure you get out there. And remember, gooutdoorstennessee.com to get your licenses, cwdintennessee.com for all CWD information, and tnwildlife.org for everything else. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.